A plus for Dave again. On time student has his shirt prepared.
Yeah, real shirts. Real shirts.
Today might be an F in terms of preparation, but we'll see. Maybe he
Oh,
could wing
it's
it.
no. I didn't prepare shit today. I barely read anything, and someone's disappointed.
Playing too much Mech Warrior.
That's exactly what happened. Played too much Mech Warrior. This is your fault. If you hadn't enabled me by getting me a better computer, I would have been more prepared for this podcast. Where are these guys?
It's already more than 5 minutes in.
You
Every
gotta
time.
you gotta start some sort of like swear jar incentive system for this.
Swear jar. My God, we're
Yeah,
gonna.
you
Oh,
you
wow!
don't
They
get
came.
swear jar.
They came at the same time.
Oh, look at that! Look at these two.
Yo, yo, yo! What's
Win.
happened?
I think I
What's
beat
happened?
Jangan by 2 seconds.
No, he
Like
beat you by 1 second.
No.
Alex, when you sell this podcast for 100 million, I get a 20. I get at least a quarter.
Oh yeah, actually,
Am I
no,
frozen?
that's a good point. How much of this do we own, Alex? How much of your podcast do we each
Well,
get?
if we split everything evenly, we get all even equity, obviously.
Yeah.
So it's fine. As long as we contribute evenly, it's all fine.
Okay.
I just need to let you know that for some reason, Alex, your face is frozen in the smirkiest, sneakiest Vietnamese man trying to take my money smile. As you said that, it was like, as long as you say.
Did you just take a picture of my smirky face?
I think so. For posterity's
I
sake.
heard a pervy click sound.
Yeah. Who was saying that? Wasn't someone saying that about the iPhones in Japan that they have to have?
Oh yes, correct.
That you can't
The
turn
sound
off. Yeah, it's impossible. To
Yeah,
turn
you
off.
can't. Yeah, it's impossible.
Who
There's
was
too many
that?
pervs.
Yeah, was that Andrew saying that? Was that you? Who was that?
No, this is. I remember hearing this from somewhere else.
Oh, okay. So I thought we talked about it.
Yeah, but that's why Android sells so well.
Oh, so smart.
Hello, Barbarians, and welcome to the 4th episode of the LLB podcast, Low Level Barbarians, from Asia, on Asia, with debate and discussion on trending topics with our usual host, man of the high ground, Dave Chang.
Hola.
Jangan, the information man and super connector. He's busy.
Hello.
And Andrew G, the master debator.
Yeah, except he's like quad or 5Gs. Is that a Chinese mobile joke?
His pronoun is 5Gs. Yes.
That's right. I'm all about that connectivity.
Oh, about that sweet CCP money.
That's right. Ching, ching, ching. Did you hear the news that the Malaysian government is introducing digital currency? Just came out this morning.
No, I didn't
missed
see that. No.
Why don't you tell us about it?
Is that your segue into fintech?
So I just read the headline news like an hour ago, but apparently the central banks of Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, South Africa, I'm not sure how South Africa fits into this whole picture, but they are in as well, going to start trading in digital currency. Seems like an awesome... Central banks. So basically interbank transfers between central banks moving towards DC. Are you guys familiar with digital currencies?
Maybe just for the sake of the audience, just explain it, just so everyone knows.
So if you think about like crypto moving towards more decentralization, nobody owning the currency itself, but it being a blockchain-based ledger that you can see every transaction that happens with that currency. Digital currency is a dream that if you could theoretically trace every cent to its origin and its complete flow, right? So imagine if every drop in the ocean you could account for within a ledger. You could know how it passes from a farmer to a FMCG services company to a lawyer's firm, and how it circles within the economy. So that's digital currency. Every dollar accounted for in a ledger. And so China launched the first version of what a central bank digital currency does. And the rest of the world is trying to figure out what the right step is, a bit cautiously, because you don't want to rush head first and then have like 200 different digital currencies. And there has been some conversations that banks will get together and form like these group alliances. I was not expecting this weird kind of tiny countries come together alliance, which is kind of interesting. But Australia 30 million population, Malaysia 30 million population, Singapore 5 billion, South Africa I'm not sure, but not exactly the strongest GDP per capita country around. But yeah, they're combining together to form some sort of centralized digital country for interbank settlements.
I mean, so how does this work then? So basically, all 4 or 5 of these countries are going to use one currency that they're going to peg to their current value of their currency. Like, what are the mechanics of it?
I literally read the headline news, so I can't tell you
Okay,
how this
okay.
works. My guess is that it's going to be some sort of automation of this settlement process itself using some kind of currency pair system, right? So right now, what happens is banks have to settle that over T+3 days or
Yeah.
T+4 days. By having it on some kind of automated ledger, you just have like instantaneous transfers, which theoretically then helps businesses,
We're
solve
Well, okay,
things
but I
faster.
mean, not to be pedantic or get bogged down to a semantics argument, but just so I'm clear from my understanding. So essentially, what we're talking about is you want to move the entire process to the blockchain, which is different
Yeah.
than rolling out like a digital currency, right?
Correct.
Well, that goes hand in hand, no?
No, they're not, but they don't go. They don't go hand in hand though, because the distributed ledger is, as Andrew explained, right? It's where basically every transaction is, or every
Oh yeah, so
interaction is
the existing
recorded
currency,
permanently.
yeah.
Yeah, it's recorded
Yeah.
permanently on the ledger, and it's immutable, right?
Yeah.
Which is so. I think a lot of times when we talk about the space, blockchain and digital currencies, they're sometimes used interchangeably. But again, just for like my own
Well,
understanding, I want to be sure that we're talking about.
can you launch a digital currency without a blockchain? That's my point.
All right. So I'm just gonna read the first two chapters of this, so you guys you
Okay.
guys get a feel of this. So central banks in Australia, Singapore, Malaysia, South Africa will conduct a cross-border payments trial. Did I freeze?
You're a bit
You're-
leggy. I mean, it's okay. It's not bad. You're still like moving around, but
No.
you're choppy.
Ah, God damn it. Yeah. I'm working directly with YTL to solve these issues, guys. It's not the best broadband world. Yeah.
Yeah, how's that going?
They've turned it off and on again a couple of times. All right. Sorry guys, I froze there for a bit. I don't know. So okay, long story short, some central bank digital currencies are for retail focus, like trying to replicate cash in circulation, whereas like other banks are being a bit more careful and looking at wholesale, like to basically cash stays cash, but the internal workings of the bank transfers within the banks move towards this digital ledger, right? And so as a consumer, when you take it out of the bank, for you there's no difference.
Yeah.
But when banks are doing their daily settlements with the central banks, when they're like buying GCs and selling them off, then you're doing that on a digital ledger, right? So I think that the trial that's happening now within these 4 or 5 countries is basically that inner workings side first before moving towards the Chinese side of things. I don't know how exciting it is. I think it's exciting in the sense that it will allow, as a consumer, settlements to become faster and theoretically like a faster movement of capital and trade, right?
One question that people have been asking is that what will happen to all these different countries if the U.S. Fed starts tapering?
If the U.S. Fed does what? Tapering?
Starts tapering the interest rates.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think one argument, because I've been following what's going on
Yeah.
in China, right? So the digital currency has been tried out across, I don't know, dozens of cities, right? I mean, a few million people have been using that, and a few major platforms have been accepting that. So a key argument is that I mean, a few things. I mean, first, I mean, some people are saying that okay, it's going to challenge the US dollars, but I don't think that's the
Oof.
case. The use is probably more domestic. Um, but but if you think about a government which tries to solve all these problems without knowing what the problems really are, and now with the digital currency, theoretically they could channel money, in a much more straightforward way. Of course, I mean, if you look at their uh, the, their announcements and the speeches by researchers from People's Bank of China, they kept saying that no, we're not going to do away with the banks. We're still rely on banks to distribute the digital currency. We still rely on banks because the banks have the fear that if the government can have direct access to people's wallets, then why do we need all these different layers of intermediaries to handle transactions? So that's a scare. And exactly how that will evolve, we don't know. But if you think about the effort that China does to ban Bitcoin mining and all these activities, is probably them trying to control this, right? I mean, because Bitcoin transcends cross borders, and you know that is something that you can't control, and what they do with things that they can't control, they
Yeah.
ban it.
Yeah, well,
I'll
that's
quickly just
always.
engage. Sorry, Dave. Go ahead.
Oh no! My just quick point is like it was always my understanding that the digital currency rollout in China is basically a control of capital outflows, right? That they're trying to basically make sure that people who have money in the PRC don't get it out. And also, I've read that this was last year that China is also rolling out global taxation regardless of residence. So basically mirroring
Oh,
the
they
Just
are.
like
U.S.
the
Wow.
US.
mirroring the U.S. models. The U.S., for those of you who
Yeah.
don't know, is the only country that does taxation based off citizenship or residency, or your
Yeah.
PR status, essentially, right? So,
Not the only. There's a couple. I think Australia does the same thing as well.
are you sure? I think it's only the
I think
U.S. for
North,
okay. Let me rephrase. Let me rephrase. So, because we
North
should
Korea as
differentiate
well.
between. No, you're right. Let me differentiate between income tax versus capital gains tax, right? So
Got
I
it.
know so several countries, you're right, do income tax, global income tax
Yeah.
taxation,
Yeah.
regardless of where you actually live. However, it's my understanding that America is the only country that has global taxation with both earned income and capital gains tax, and it's my understanding
Unless
that
you do not have a tax treaty with the US. So as a Malaysian citizen, shout out to anyone from a country that doesn't have a tax treaty with the US. You get to buy stuff without capital gains tax, which is incredible, right?
Well,
So
assuming your country doesn't have capital gains.
yeah, so your country doesn't have
yes,
capital gains
assuming your
itself.
country doesn't
Yeah.
have
So
capital gains. So
Malaysia,
like
Singapore, they don't have. Yeah.
so like if you're in Malaysia and Singapore, you're in this incredible loophole that allows you to buy these tech stocks in the US. So the catch is you do have to pay 30% dividend withholding tax, which really sucks. But then just buy tech stocks that don't pay you
Yeah, buy growth
dividends.
stocks.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which
Buy
is
growth
basically all
stocks.
tech stocks. Like every tech stock doesn't pay
Yeah.
dividends,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, my portfolio
Yeah.
is like I don't know, like I may regret this 5 years from now, but right now it's 90% tech probably.
No, you won't
Um,
regret it.
No, you won't.
yeah,
I think you'll be fine.
I feel like I'm doing. I buy the stuff I know, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah. So just to like loop back on the central bank digital currency. Sorry, Alex. I know we have topics, but just like it seems kind of exciting. This the reason why banks push for central bank digital currency is this idea that if you know where flows are happening, number one, you get to prevent wrongdoing, whether that's corruption or any sort of illegal activity using currency. And the second reason is you get to deploy capital better to um, individuals that need it, right? So if you want to give cash to people that are poor, you actually know how much, like if you have a ledger that knows exactly how much money they have, how much they've been spending, whether they've been spending it well and not buying, say, alcohol and like the things that you don't approve of, it gives you this ridiculous big brother control of giving money to the people that actually deserve it, right? And that's like an incredible story if it's done right. And if you think about the Chinese government, it's a reflection of how they've treated IP packets, right? The fact that you can see how information flows and then determine whether or not that information is being used justifiably within the values that they've set about as a national system. And they're doing the same thing now with corporations as well, right? So it's a follow on from that. Theoretically, what they're able to do then is also expand their sphere of influence using that digital currency. Meaning, like if you give a loan to Sri Lanka for $4 billion port or a new, industrial facility, you can then tag along that aid to that government with specific conditions and determine whether those conditions feed back into the values of what they consider to be a legitimate partner to the Chinese government, right? So I think the Chinese government uses it more as a tool first for domestic control, but secondly, and I theorize that they will use this as a tool for their domination and expansion of spheres of influence, right? Um, I think the counter and so to Jiangan's point about like will the US dollar get replaced? I do think there is a point that's going to happen where there's going to be a basket of currencies led presumably by the renminbi that will eventually replace the dominance of the US dollar, and it won't come in the form that we know of it because a lot of these systems that we take for granted, they haven't existed for that long. 1973 Bretton Woods. Before that, like the gold standard was replaced maybe 30, 40 years before that. So there's a revolution happening within the next 10, 15 years of our life. And I think digital currencies will play a role there. I'm not exactly sure of the form it will. Um, but just if anybody wants to dive deeper into this topic, there's this guy, Balaji Srinivasan has a article on India Stack and how India is building an alternative, like third third route stack towards central bank controlled currencies. And it's a very interesting perspective of how the free movement of currencies could build off of cryptocurrencies without governance from a body like a government.
But that's actually just a one question though. I don't think there will be. I can't envision a world where the CCP would ever give up control of their currency, right? Like
Yeah.
it's sort of like embedded into the bargain is that it's a digital currency name, but it's still going to be controlled by a centralized party.
Oh, hell yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can't picture that ever happening. You know, it's
But you know what they could do with it, and so like this is one of Balaji's things, right? He's like the India stack that has been built without crypto, UPIs, payment networks, and other for like verified credentials can
yeah,
be the system that plugs into the global cryptocurrency system. So, for example, Anderson Horowitz's first investment in Southeast Asia was the creators of a game, Axie Infinity, that
yeah,
allows you to like work part-time and mine crypto, right? It's just crazy. Like the
Yeah.
first investment, A16
yeah.
CDES in Southeast Asia, happens to be a crypto investment. And if you think about what that means, like India is probably poised to be a recipient of non-central controlled currencies, right? Like you know, like if you work part-time as a freelancer in India doing IT work or customer service, could you get paid with Bitcoin, Ether, and other things, right? Could you then translate that into currency that you can use to buy on Flipkart? Right. So there is a sort of a symbolic system that's missing right now to allow global trade to the smallest atoms of individual workers in India, and then allows them to then utilize that in a way that they can use locally, right? And I think that system will happen a bit more organically in India, but in China maybe enforced. Like I think China realizes the potential of crypto. They'll probably plug it into the CBDC and allow some kind of an exchange.
You talk about. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. You talk about India, the Aadhaar, right?
Yeah.
The biometric identification system. So I happen to know the guy who was in charge of the rollout. Not Nandan Nilekani, who was the chairman, who sorted out all the strategy and politics, but a guy called Ram Sharma, and who is now, I think, is he still the chairman of Telecom Regulatory Authority? But before he was the director general in charge of the implementation of Aadhaar. So when I was in Delhi, I used to sort of meet him quite regularly. Um, the program was very, very smartly designed. I think one key use case they were trying to address is that before that, I mean, you know, Indian government is more socialist than most governments in
Yeah.
this world. So they distribute lots of welfare, lots of subsidies. But traditionally, the distribution has not been very efficient because there's lots of intermediaries, and as a result, first there's leakage, and second is that, I mean, you really don't know whether the money has reached out to the final people that you want the money to go to. So they designed this so that there's a central database and people's biometrics are kept, and whatever that you do, you can verify. I mean, the person is really who the person is
Yeah.
before any transaction can happen. But of course, that's just a verification system. The
Yeah.
payment and etc. is not part of that. So it doesn't close the whole loop yet. But I would imagine if any government has the centralized digital currency, I mean, there are lots of things they can do.
Yeah.
And even if you think about the macroeconomic economic planning, so China will probably know exactly how much the economy is growing instead of relying on local officials to submit
Yeah.
all these surveys, which they might or might not
Nonsense.
trust.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
I'll make 2 points. Like, I think everything that we're talking to just is exactly what everyone in the cryptocurrency space specifically are talking to, right? You're talking more efficient capital, and that's very traceable, and it's in a sense, right? So what it's like this kind of just decentralization versus centralization, and
Mm.
what we're all talking about is building out the infrastructure to kind of build out that world. And the only question in my mind though is like, if digital currency does become bigger and bigger, which I think it will coexist with normal fiat. And cryptocurrency essentially only needs to be widely adopted if it becomes fiat itself, right? What happens to managing business cycles, right? Because traditionally, right, with money supply, the way it works is like you print more money by buying and selling like bonds or something like this, right, to control the money supply. How does that actually work with digital currencies then? It's a very different mechanism, correct?
No, you
I
set the
mean,
rules. I mean, if you think about it, like governments raise or modify the system of how a country runs by three things, right? You quantitative easing, which is basically printing more money, raising and reducing interest rates, and lastly by some kind of fiscal management, right? By launching
Yeah,
projects and then
but
like supporting
that's
them.
by physically buying up assets and selling assets, right? Like
No,
actual
no, the third
bonds.
one is literally
no.
saying, oh, we'll
Yes, it is.
spend
That's how money supply
4 billion.
works. If you want to increase the
No,
money supply, you buy bonds or sell bonds. That's it.
yeah, no, that's the first one. That's the
Yeah.
first one.
Yeah.
So quantitative easing, interest rates, and then fiscal management, meaning like we're going to spend 100 billion and like take over Afghanistan, whatever, and then like figure out how you support that with either of one or two, right? Let's not get into Afghanistan, but um,
I have a lot to say about that.
I think what then happens if you have a digital
And
currency, it's no difference because what then happens is interest rates, you do it the same way you used to. Quantitative easing, instead of selling it, I mean, right now, if you think about it, when a bank settles at the end of the day, it's not like someone physically goes to a bank and gives them a briefcase, right? Like ones
Yeah.
and zeros actually change, and then they go like, all right, you got some, I got some, done. And so the same thing happens, except the underlying software protocol at which it happens is just a different system. That's it. And so everything else, the guy who's going to the ATM and taking it out, it's going to be the same. Now, to your point about whether fiat will coexist, my position is that digital currencies will be fiat, meaning central banks. Like think about right now in most countries that are moving towards that direction, most transactions happen using a non-physical uh, asset, right? Meaning you use your phone to scan a QR code or you use a little physical credit card, right? Use a bit of cash, but cash will eventually just dwindle the same way newspapers went. And at some point, we'll show our kids like little coins and tell them at some point we used to have to carry that in our pockets and it makes a little jangly sound, right? I don't think our kids will actually know what a coin does,
That'd
right?
be amazing,
But
man.
they'll, sorry?
That would be amazing.
No, it's true. I mean, like, have you seen a child look at the twirly cord of a corded phone and go, "What is this?" Or cassette? And these were like
Yeah.
the iPhone came out in 2007 for a sense of scale, right? But there are kids who are in their teens today who don't know what the twirly cord of a corded phone is,
Yeah.
right? And so if you project 20 years down the line, coins will be this cool thing that they show in museums, and cash money will be a cool thing that they show in museums, right? But so when you use your credit card or when you use your wallet, behind that, the software protocol layer will be this digital currency, right? To the end user, there is no difference. But
Yeah.
at the software and infra layer, there's a huge amount of things that are happening there, and that will allow probably better credit scoring, better protection of people who are vulnerable, better ways of routing resources, a more fungible, more liquid asset layer with how currencies are used. So I think that's what will happen. Like, but from our perspective as consumers, you're just
Okay.
not going to see much of a difference.
we mentioned about how do you call that? The sort of management cycles, right? I mean, theoretically, if the government has all the data about each transaction that's happening in society on a real basis, and I'm not looking at you,
No, no,
you
I'm
would
good.
not
We're good, guys.
have the cycles theoretically, right? You will not have the cycles
Yeah.
because I mean cycles are not a good thing.
I would.
It's just because
Yeah.
policy adjustments have lags, and
Yeah.
and you don't even know when it's taking effect. You don't know what the effect is until like much later.
Yeah.
So theoretically, if you have all the data to you real time, then if you manage that responsibly, there will be no cycles.
Yeah, I would like to. I'll probably have to deep dive on that on like on a separate segment of EOA where I talk to experts on this because I kind of really wonder, is that really exactly the utopia where business? I mean, why do business cycles exist? Right, there's some over exuberance in one part of the market or not, but It would be very interesting to see if what you're saying comes true. But I think let's move on to the next segment since we spent enough time on the cryptocurrency part. Well, sorry, not crypto, but more of digital currencies. So Andrew wanted to talk about the section, the future of SaaS, which I think is a very interesting topic for Southeast Asia. Which is a very kind of nascent market for SaaS. I honestly couldn't find too much information of anyone writing specifically on Southeast Asian SaaS, other than a few VCs doing PR articles. But I did find one guy who wrote two pretty decent articles on SaaS. Dev Kare, I believe is how you pronounce his name. He's a partner at Lightspeed Ventures, and he wrote his first article in 2014 where he just kind of describes the Indian context for SaaS, and then he wrote another article in 2019 which broadly talks about India and Southeast Asia as well. But his first piece basically describes SaaS coming in four different waves, right? The first wave was in the late 80s and the early 90s, starting with accounting softwares tied to desktop. The second wave was in the late 90s with corporate-led SaaS, outsourced from companies like Oracle, where it's finance and ERP. Right? Then you have the third wave in the 2000s for India, which was antivirus and CRM. And the fourth wave was, from 2010 onwards, where he was predicting that SaaS was going to be based off cloud native companies only, right? And those are more of the companies that we know today, right? The Atlassians, the Zendesk, the Salesforce, and those kind of things. And I think you could think of Southeast Asia in very similar ways, but maybe different time periods. We do have these kind of mostly for Southeast Asia, we have a lot of imports for SaaS that was well known, right? Everyone's using Slack. People are using like QuickBooks and Xero. And that's a little bit differentiated when you get to maybe more localized kind of companies where you have to do HR specific tasks, right? So I guess my question to you guys is, how do you guys see SaaS unfolding? Who are the players? Is it possible for Southeast Asia to have a SaaS company that's developed that it can have a global scale, or does it have to be very local focused, where it's like, India plus Southeast Asia? What do you guys think? Andrew, this was your topic, so.
Yeah.
I think he's frozen.
Sorry, guys, my connection isn't exactly the greatest today. Yeah. We're gonna work on this connection thing. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, we can hear you. Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. So I guess the reason why I brought this topic up is if you look at VC in developed markets, traditionally after this wave of investing in these asset-heavy companies and this B2C growth, there is a movement towards B2B, specifically B2B SaaS, right? And it's in the US and Europe, they've come in different forms of companies developing software stacks that help these startups to grow. And sometimes the complexity of these B2B SaaS tools also is kind of shocking. For example, in the US, you'll find multiple competitors of tools to solve cap table issues, right? And what generally then happens is startups all across the globe end up using these American tools. And it seems to me like then there's a dearth of opportunities for startups to exist in non-developed markets that are developing B2B SaaS tools. So theoretically, there's almost two approaches that can happen. One is startups create a B2B SaaS tool that provides a service that solves a very clear emerging markets problem. And so an example of that is, so there's Freshworks in India, right? So if you guys are familiar with Twilio in the US that develops this like whole suite of connectivity tools, there's been two companies that have been on my radar. One is Infobip, which is Croatian. It's Croatia's first unicorn, and Freshworks, which is an Indian startup. And like if you think like both these companies have built their software stack on top of WhatsApp, right? And what they do is they provide suites of connectivity tools. And if you think about WhatsApp, like the US doesn't use WhatsApp as much as a lot of other nations, and as a result, that kind of maturity around building tools around WhatsApp doesn't exist in the US, and so there's a clear white space there. So that's like the first kind of tangent, right? So it's like emerging markets solution using existing tools, building on top of that tools. The second is whether there's just like complete standalone opportunities that no one's looking at, and these are like super fresh unicorns. And so there's like two examples I can think of. You've got Canva in Australia that came up with an incredible way to design and storytell that doesn't look that sophisticated at first, but then you look under the hood, it's an incredible product, right? In Malaysia, you have PictoChart that was very close to what Canva was developing several years ago. I'm not sure what the status of them are. So that's the second thing, like the complete unicorn, like fresh out of nowhere, right? And then I guess the third is like, do you then build a tool that I guess this is the hardest one, right? Can you build a startup that's so special that it just starts taking over a lot of the world in ways that we don't even think of? So Atlassian is a perfect example. Australian startup started by two blokes who still own, I think, 60% of the company, even post IPO. And now it's like every tech company uses them, right? So I guess I wanted to have this open conversation to see, like, do we see in Southeast Asia, is it predominantly going to be the first way where we just end up finding like weird emerging market stories and building for them? Or do we actually see? Go ahead.
It's interesting because I think you kind of have come to the same framework that Dev Kare has. I probably didn't put it very succinctly, but he kind of puts from 2010 onwards, where it's cloud native, right? He puts in two categories: workflow automation or tools, right? And you kind of separated those two with those different business models that you're talking about from like Freshworks or like, for example, a tool like Canva, right? So, and then the other thing that he frames works is that he believes that there's an Eastern versus Western category. Western kind of been very global focused. So I make a product, but I sell globally. And Slack kind of works everywhere globally, right? But the other one you're talking about is that emerging focused only, where it's just Indian. Plus, then in order to increase the valuation, because the biggest argument against what he's saying is that the TAM is too small because it's very fragmented, right? So it's very emerging market specific problems, which a big SaaS ecosystem can grow, but is it limited by size is the question. Right. So then he goes on to say is that the way people do is like my home country plus Southeast Asia plus China plus whatever. And then it has to be very emerging markets focused. So he believes that there's this whole category that's untapped and can go much deeper. So I guess the question is, do you guys believe that the TAM is kind of constrained due to regional differences and very more unique problems because it's more emerging market focused? Or can something from Southeast Asia become a Canva that's more globally used?
I mean, I think this. So go ahead. No, go ahead, Shankar. No, please. I insist. You go ahead.
Your name starts with D, which is your final J. So go ahead.
You're older. You're older, so I defer to you. So you go ahead.
Screw you.
Okay. No, seriously, please go ahead. I'm still formulating anyway.
No, I think a few things. So you guys probably know there's this company in Singapore called PetSnap, which basically helps companies manage their intellectual property, check databases, etc., etc. I do remember in 2016. Was that 2016?
They raised 17.
I didn't meet the team. I mean, it's a unicorn now. I didn't meet the team in 2016, but I was at AUS Suzhou campus in China, where PetSnap's office is. I remember that day. It was a week before Chinese New Year. A few startups from Singapore crammed there because they thought that the market in China was big, and also because I think some incentives from Singapore government so that they could go there with a very low cost. They switched off the aircon, I mean the heating basically for the whole day because they said they wanted to save on electricity, and that was the situation they were in. And I spoke with the lady who was running the accelerator there, and PetSnap was there, and she said, most companies are here. Many companies were here because nobody in Singapore believed that they could be viable, so they come here because of subsidies and because they save the cost. But that company was addressing a global problem, right? I mean, the enterprises have that intellectual property issue they need to run across countries, and if each one builds their own database, that's not feasible. If someone spends effort over the years to have all these things connected, that offers value to people. So that's Singapore, right? I mean, you have lots of MNCs with headquarters here, original headquarters here, and you have companies which are able to build SaaS for enterprise. With large subscription fees, and that's only one side. And the second side is that the issues that they do deal with the businesses in the region and maybe beyond. So for instance, I mean, you guys know Shopify. Is Shopify SaaS or is it Shopify platform?
SaaS,
I would say that most people say SaaS.
It's a
But now
platform.
they've launched
Um,
the marketplace side of
No, well,
things.
it's becoming a yeah.
It's
I
becoming
think
a platform.
The long-term play is going to be a platform, but I think initially, right, it's SaaS, I guess.
Yeah.
How do you think Shopify is doing in this region?
It's pretty big, right? I know a lot of SMEs that use it. Like anecdotally, I mean, I don't know the actual numbers.
You
I don't know
mean
the
you
numbers.
mean in terms of like transaction volume, or you're talking about like just like number of like premium accounts or Shopify Plus accounts?
In terms of number of accounts, I mean,
Must be very-
doesn't matter what is.
No, well, transaction volume is okay. But to answer your question, my guess is probably it's quite poor. This would be my guess.
I'm not sure about now, but about a year ago, I tried Shopify with a friend for a small business, and you know what was the biggest problem we had with Shopify?
Payments
Too slow?
Nope.
To me, it's either too slow or payments typically is a problem.
Yeah.
You
Well,
every
can't.
time.
I mean, I'm not sure about now, but back then I remember you couldn't. There's no way for you to register account with just phone number and no email address.
Interestingly enough, though, I had a lot of problems with Shopify circa 2014 when I was doing Rent Address, and it was not robust. It was not like where it is today. But apparently today, if you use it, and if you look at all the consultants in the third-party markets who service Shopify, and all these kind of consultants who build for these small companies, it's a lot more robust now, from what I understand at least. So they have gone to a point where it's probably more serviceable and more of this kind of global product, I guess. I thought I would shy away from it, but I even like Amazing Grace is looking at some hybrid solution of this, right? I think for Shopify. So I don't know. It seems that they are improving, and it is getting better where they start to localize more to make sure it works. That's my guess. I don't know.
It is. It is. My point is that I mean there are always these kind of small things which would sort of make the experience not that fantastic, and you probably hear lots of people. I mean, even people like us who have sufficient global exposure complaining about SaaS from global SaaS which do not have customer
I see your
service.
point. I see your point.
Right. I mean, and how do you service the customers in emerging markets? I mean, how do you build small features in a localized way? I mean, Facebook has been trying to localize the e-commerce part, and they just can't do it.
Well, Facebook is also like I think a notoriously poor platform for anyone that's ever used like Facebook Business Manager deeply. It's terrible.
Oh God.
But I mean, okay. So I guess my thought about this is also I think in the question that you're asking for me, there's a context of like what is the sales approach for SaaS, right? So the way I understand SaaS sales is there's typically two approaches, right? There's the top-down approach and there's the bottom-up approach. So the top-down approach is like the traditional approach where you go and you wine and dine the CIO and then the CEO or the CFO or whoever it is, right?
Yeah.
And then you sell them a software suite of, and it's worth like $10 million a year or whatever it is, right? And then there's a bottom-up approach, which is sort of like the what's a good example, like a Zoom or like a Box example, where you just get people within the organization to adopt the product because it's a cool feature, and then eventually enough you get a critical mass of users inside the organization, and then the CIO or whoever's in charge of procurement is almost like pigeonholed into buying it because it just becomes so readily obvious, right? And so I think in your point about PatSnap, it's a specific example where it's a Singaporean-based company, but as you mentioned, it's in a market where there are a lot of large MNCs and solving like a very specific problem that I think it's idiosyncratic to a company that's based in Singapore or an equivalent to Singapore, because you have a lot of these large corporations that are headquartering their Asia operations there, and you have that customer base that's there, right? I think if you were to try and build a similar product, I don't know, let's say in Cambodia, I'm toss on as in Cambodia, like an IP management product, I think it's very difficult because then you just don't have that feedback with your client base unless your founders are traveling to Singapore on a regular basis, right? So I think my point is, it's like to ask that question, I think when you really deep dive into like, one, where was that company actually founded? Is it in like a large regional hub? Or if that's the case, then yes, I think you could build a regional or global company even, right? But if we're talking about like a more remote market where you don't necessarily have access to those client base and you have to go a different approach, I think we're talking about a regional plus model.
Yeah. It seems that it alludes to that it's not really black or white. It seems that the Southeast Asia region is going to have a plethora of SaaS that could be global focused depending where it's based, or it could just be very homegrown, solving local problems, and has different TAM sizes, I guess.
Yeah.
So it seems that, but I think the one thing we can agree on is probably very early stages still, and there's plenty of room for growth and investment in this area that either you could be building or investing and taking advantage of, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Any final comments on this before we move on?
One thing is that I mean, if you look at PetSnap per se, it's not too much product focused as much as it's about sort of accumulating a database and putting all the resources together. I'm not sure you guys know a company in India called Postman.
No.
No.
It does. I mean, it's a product designed for developers, and it helps people with API. And I think the company was valued what, a few $1 billion.
Wow.
When I first took a look at this company, I think back in 2015, it was like it just raised one round of funding, and many people said that the problem it was trying to resolve was too small, too tough. But over the years, I know like two investors and one or two investors in India consistently backing that, and now it's a unicorn. And I spoke with some of these investors. They said that I mean, in India, it's possible because not only because it's English speaking, but also because you really get to tap into lots of tech talent to build this kind of products, which requires lots of tech.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very interesting point because we're at a point in time after so much money has come into the system and older e-commerce models and all the other kind of plethora of startups that are coming up. There's enough talent to do it now, tech-wise, and we have certain regional hubs like Vietnam where there is a tech base that can support this. I mean, it seems like there's enough infrastructure at this point where SaaS can really just build off and take off. So, yeah, it's a good point.
I think in Southeast Asia, only Vietnam has the tech
correct.
talent base to support
Yes,
that.
correct.
I mean, Singapore has a good base, but can you build a team that actually scales in Singapore? Because I mean, Google is here, Tencent is here, ByteDance is here.
A lot of people
the
do
amount
though,
of money
right?
they can offer to people.
I feel a lot of people do that, right? Though, isn't that like the short-term trend? I think so, right?
Tech?
To what, the
Yeah. So
scale
like
in Singapore?
I talked to a lot of tech guys in other podcasts, right? And their take is that if you've raised too much money, they say just build a team directly in Singapore because you have access to the talent. But the problem is, of course, you'd be fighting for a very small pool, obviously. But like, it just seems to be that the short-term trend is that's what I think is happening. Like, if you're headquartered there, you kind of build a tech team there, which doesn't make sense long-term. It does make more sense to do kind of a Vietnam and figure it out. But the problem is like no one has the connections. Like no one's connected to that, like the American Vietnamese guy who commands an army of tech followers because he's a tech rock star.
My take is this: it depends on what you mean by talent, right? So
Yeah.
like a lot of people end up having hubs in like Vietnam or Moscow or any of these cheaper geographies.
Yeah, correct.
But when it comes to hiring, like, look, if you're trying to hire someone who is a CTO of a pretty significant American startup and entice them to come to Southeast Asia, it's most likely they're going to move to Singapore for lifestyle reasons, right? If you look at what Gojek has done, like Gojek has this leadership team now that's a lot of people that they've hired from the US, and a lot of them have actually just settled down in Singapore.
Correct.
Shopee is doing the same thing as well, right? So I think it's not tech talent that's already in Singapore. It's like, can I entice successful CTOs to come and move to Southeast Asia where they're most likely to live?
Yeah, and when you have the money, you can do that, right? It's just long term is a question. I think that's will that sustain?
Exactly.
I think somebody should do I mean, maybe not look at developers, but somebody should do a sort of a breakdown of product managers of Grab-C and look at the provenance of these people. And I don't think many are actually from Southeast Asia.
Well, since you brought it up, Janggan, I feel like you volunteered yourself.
Yes, thank you. Momentum works.
I have a team.
Jangan, I cannot wait to see this report.
Yeah. Well, but one last comment though. I think Lazada had the foresight early on, based off like how Rocket started. Even Rocket, the first tech team was in China. That was just really hard communication wise. Moved it to Philippines. That just blew up. And then they kind of landed building a tech team in Vietnam long term. And I don't know, Andrew, is the tech team still based in Vietnam?
No, it was hilarious. So what happened was it was Vietnam. And then because our CTO at the time was Russian, we ended up having a Moscow hub, and talent was incredibly cheap because the ruble collapsed, right? And there was like this sudden group of like very cheap developers in Russia. So actually the biggest growth stage we had, I think the largest group of developers we had was all based out of Russia. And so at some point we had Russia, Vietnam, and then Singapore was like data science and a bit more technical stuff. The product team was also in Singapore. And then, so it was 3 hubs, and then post-acquisition, Shenzhen became the tech hub, and Moscow
it went back.
Moscow was closed. And then now I think it's Vietnam, Singapore, Shenzhen.
So interesting. So Vietnam still persisted. And the interesting thing is because my friend who's American Vietnamese did a lot of consulting based in Vietnam to help build out the early team there. So it was just because of one guy was there and he had the talent and was able to help outfit it, and it's still lasting today. So it's interesting.
And I think why Grab built a research center in Seattle in the first place was because somebody they hired wanted to be in Seattle. And why they built a research center in Beijing is because a team which was just obliterated by DD and had to find other things to do, and they acquired a full team, and team is based in Beijing. So that's why they built on top of that team.
And I guess with remote these days, you kind of follow where the talent wants to be. Otherwise, you don't get the talent, right? Someone else will take it. So you kind of end up with these interesting hubs. Okay.
Shall we move on?
Yeah, let's move on to the next topic. The last topic is the role of government in startups and innovation. So this was started by Dave. Dave sent this interesting article, which is very Malaysian specific. It's about this government arm called MDEC, Malaysia Digital Economy Corporation. And the mandate for MDEC is very interesting, which I found out is that their main job since 1996, when they were founded, is to drive FDI into the country, create local champions, and create a flourishing ecosystem for digital adoption, right? And they kind of do this by having different local programs. And we could talk about the recent scandal or hoo-ha in Malaysia, or we could speak to the larger implications of the region and the role of government. But essentially, what happened was the government I don't know which government hired the recent CEO for MDEC. And I guess the prevailing view in the article that we read was that she was incompetent and basically failed. And within 2.5 years, she had to leave. I guess the more nuanced view is that she was kind of set up to fail. Her background was not suited to be someone driving FDI for a country. She was a banker who operated in the US for more than, 20 years, 16 years as a banker. So maybe she would have been more suited for the local government VC arm MAFCAP. Being an outsider didn't help. She couldn't ingratiate to the way the leadership was kind of working. And it's really hard to say though, if it was fair to call that she was, the least impactful, because she only worked 2.5 years. Her predecessors worked for 4 years or longer. So it's hard to say, what that might have looked out for the next 2 years if she stayed. And also, I think she should get more credit because of COVID and the effects of that. But people were still being very harshly critical. Dave, I don't know. Why don't you take it off since this was your piece?
Well, I don't. Oh God, you can do this to me. Okay. I mean, I don't have a strong viewpoint. I just think this would be an interesting conversation. One, because of the recent events in Malaysia, and two, also, if we look at, and to bring back the old topic, especially what's been happening in China in the last month, right? Like when we first started the podcast, that was when the crackdowns, when China first initiated their string of programs, reforms, whatever you want to call them, right? And then sort of as it's progressed, we're seeing more and more what their roadmap is, right? And to me, with the recent regulations on the amount of hours kids can spend playing video games, theoretical end to the 996 work framework, it just seems that the Chinese government has basically, in my eyes, said for the last 15, 20 years, maybe more, 30 years, right? Ever since when China opened up, their core focus was on economic development, right? That was their main interest. But now they're sort of going back the other way, sort of back to the roots of the party, where we're saying we're going to be more ideologically driven and more about the welfare of the people, right? And I feel like the Chinese example has been it's an instructive example of what can be accomplished by a government vis-a-vis tech. And then you sort of contrast that with the Malaysian MDEC magic. There's nothing but soup of these agencies, right? I feel like these agencies in Malaysia have really not shown much in the results in terms of either FDI or Malaysian startups. I mean, the Carson example is sort of they're touting that, but I think it's like a fringe case. So for me, it's really just a conversation about everyone's ideas and thoughts about like what is the right role of government, or what is the best way that they can play the ecosystem. And for me, since I brought it up, I guess I'll start. I think the best way I can think of it is in terms of like, setting up these regulatory these one-off agencies like MDEC or Magic or whatever. Not to criticize the people that work there, it seems to be an effective way of doing it, right? So if you think about MDEC's stated purpose, if FDI is a primary driver, and you think about like what actually drives FDI, it's going to be things like political stability,
Tax incentives.
your incentive, yeah, your currency, your wage rates, your tax rates, transportation infrastructure,
Yeah.
size of your local market, all these things, right? And these are things that an agency. So MDEC, for those who don't know, is under the Ministry of I think Media and Communications or Telecommunications, right? These
Yes.
are factors that sort of agency can realistically impact, especially in an environment such as Malaysia, where the politics are so factional. It's impossible. So for me, that approach just seems like a very misguided approach, right? Because it really has to come like if you're going to make something like this successful, you really need to come from like a top down mandate directed one, like the one that they took in China, where the CCP were like, we're going to open up, we're going to invite all these tech companies in, right? We're going to have strings attached, which is basically like knowledge transfer. You're going to give us all of your IP, and we'll give you access to our markets, and that's, I think, is proven to be very successful, right? And I think the Malaysian case has just not been. So that's my starting off point.
Yeah, I mean,
guys.
it's interesting because, well, you kind of point out that China is very command, and you kind of they also set up the infrastructure to kind of allow it to happen. And if you think the closest government that could possibly replicate that might be Vietnam, probably. But the other interesting fact is I think every country has similar agencies like Malaysia. And the question is, I don't know if these are really effective or not. Because the other libertarian view is that maybe government shouldn't even bother and let the markets kind of figure it out themselves, right? So I don't know.
But I mean, my view is that you should not even bother what the government is bothering doing.
There you go.
But how can you? But how can you?
I mean,
How can you? How can you not, though?
if
I mean, that's like. But like, let's say like.
I mean,
Go ahead. Sorry.
go ahead.
No. You just finish your point.
So if you look at China, at each level of local government, there's all this like proliferation of these useless agencies, which do lots of events. I mean, sort of accelerators, trade shows,
correct.
which many of them eventually turned out to be sort of real estate projects. But entrepreneurs just didn't care. I mean,
Yeah.
if there's something that's interesting that can make use of, I mean, cheap rent for half a year, like the pet snap idea, the company I mentioned just now. Sure, we use it, but if there's nothing that I can gain from, I stay away from it. But China's different because its market is big. It's big. I mean,
True.
Dave, you mentioned about knowledge transfer. I remember a few years ago, I was talking to somebody from the Mexican government. That was during the days of Felipe Calderon, and drug wars. So they told me that okay, they were trying to get the transfer of knowledge and technology from MNCs which invested in Mexico, but people just didn't care. I mean, if you try to force them, and they go to Costa Rica. But China's a different case because people make compromises. They want that market, and I think that's the leverage big country governments would have if they open up their access to the domestic market. And also another point that Alex brought up, the infrastructure. I mean, if you look at all the road, railroad, airports, whatever that Chinese government has built, and I mean that made lots of things possible. I mean, the KYC infrastructure they built for the banks that allowed Alipay and WeChat Pay to start.
Regulation as well.
If you think about, I mean, if Alipay had to do the KYC on every single customer, and I mean, imagine the cost they would need to develop this whole system.
No, I agree with you. I mean, I think you're right. The IP knowledge transfer part it's uniquely Chinese because they're probably the only market that can command that sort of leverage over companies coming in, right? And I agree with you that like a lot of these like accelerator days, demo days, whatever, it's kind of like it's very ego driven. There's not a lot of value being added to it. Maybe like I think the better model is like what Singapore did, where essentially I think okay, so maybe we keep it local, right? I think the Singapore model is actually a really good model where anyone that got Temasek money, the mandate was if you take money from a Temasek or Temasek is a Singapore sovereign wealth fund for the listeners. Basically, any tech company that received a round of funding led by Temasek had to move their headquarters to Singapore, which is sort of the story of how Malaysia lost Grab. For those who don't know, so Grab was originally a Malaysian company started by Malaysian. The original operations were in Malaysia, and then at some point, I think the C or D round, I don't remember what it was. Temasek led the round, and they had to move their headquarters, and I think that's probably the better way, right? So I think Singapore, what their approach essentially was a couple things, right? So at the early stage, they injected a lot of liquidity into the early venture ecosystem, right? So for a period of time, and I want to say like 2016 to 2018, basically any tech company that started in Singapore, and didn't have to be owned by Singaporean, but just headquartered in Singapore, was eligible for a significant amount of grants from the Singaporean government. I think they were giving out somewhere between like 100 to 200,000. And it wasn't very difficult to get, from what I understand. So that's like at the bottom, but sort of like building up this foundation. And then at the very sort of like late stage, they're essentially forcing all these large tech companies to move to Singapore and put their base of operations and be domiciled there. So I think they addressed those two ends of the spectrum very, very well. And I think that's like the failing on Malaysia side is for a long time, right? They try to execute the liquidity in the market with initiatives like NavCap, and there's a bunch of grants. But I think they missed out on that late stage where they became obsessed with having, I think, what my impression is like Malaysian grown companies, where I think what they should sympathize is having large tech companies in Malaysia, regardless of their origin, as long as we just eventually domicile there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because I want to pick on Jagan's view, because if you feel that we shouldn't care what governments are doing, are you saying Singapore has been ineffective? I mean, of course, they benefit from infrastructure too. Like they developed fully. And then, of course, when they deploy these policies, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy where if you have the reputation, they're just going to come there anyway, right? So I mean, I guess there's that nuance. But do you think Singapore has not done a good job then, or you don't care? But it seems like you're benefiting from being in Singapore, and government policies have helped then, right?
Well, I mean, I think a few things. First, we need to look at the government as a whole, right? What they have done collectively, different agencies, and all the infrastructure they've built. I mean, it's not only just the broadband, the roads, etc., etc. Yeah, and also Singapore made it really easy for other venture capital to set up. I mean, a family offices. Just look at how many family offices have set up in Singapore for the last year and a half.
Yeah,
correct.
So we put all these people, all this capital, and all these resources together. Even though many of the money invested, even many of the grants invested went to waste, but at the end of the day, I mean, we're in the venture space, right? I mean, if only 10% of only 5% of them, I mean, reach their sort of full use, then you have a vibrant ecosystem which works. And also, I mean, Singapore also benefited from the fact that the many Chinese companies, I mean, the geopolitics, right? I mean, many Chinese companies now are setting up their headquarters in Singapore. I mean, I think Malaysia tried historically to get these companies to set up in Malaysia. I remember for a while, I mean, maybe still the case, Huawei's South Pacific headquarters is in Malaysia. But I just felt that it was not done in a very, very sort of collaborative and consistent way.
Yeah.
Jens, I've been very quiet because I just don't like commenting on Malaysian politics or the Malaysian government.
Well, you
As
can comment on
the
other
sole
countries.
Malaysian in the room, as the sole Malaysian in this room, who's probably at the highest risk. Jagan can say whatever he wants because he's within Singapore's sovereign borders. I'm going to watch my words very carefully here. But so, okay, my take on this is, it depends on what you think the role of the government is, and some governments act like corporations in terms of trying to like participate in nation building as a effort to build something that's going to last legacies and endure. Right? Singapore takes that approach. Right? The Lee family, in the way that they built policies, structures, systems, how the highest paid government workers globally are Singaporean government workers, right? Because it's become a job that you aspire to as a young one in Singapore, right? So it's a very different beast when we talk about Singapore and everyone else, right? Now, I think fundamentally the government has, with regards to the tech ecosystem, it needs to solve a couple of core issues. The first is you try to figure out where are the real fundamental drivers. Okay, so some context here, right? I spent 9 months with the World Bank working on a project called EPIC, Entrepreneurship Program for Innovation in the Caribbean. It's an incredible project. I actually just did it because I wanted to hang out in the beaches of Bahamas, which I got to do a lot. But the point of the project was to actually understand what makes successful ecosystems develop around tech, and then try to replicate that in Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad, working directly with venture banks and like the local, startup incubators. So I did a lot of studies looking at Berlin, looking at Israel, looking at Tel Aviv, trying to understand Mumbai, like what made these ecosystems kick up. And fundamentally, the first biggest driver is talent, right? You need to have human capital that can drive this ridiculous innovation, right? Because ultimately you're looking at factors at like patents per capita as a factor of like productivity in terms of intellectual capital, right? You're looking at factors like how much trademarks does your company generate, whether it's hardware manufacturing, software, whatever it is, like, is there new ideas that are coming out? Is there a process and system to support those new ideas? And then is there a framework to commercialize those ideas, monetize them, and make them bigger, right? The issue with a lot of governments is they end up having a lot of these systems that actually do a lot of show and tell. You have accelerators and hackathons and meetups, and then that isn't really solving the real. Like, if you don't have the capital talent, then what is the point of all your accelerators and hackathons, right? What is the point of all these organizations that's bring 200 people together when 200 of them aren't exactly world class, right? So my take on this is, however, that being said, and this is like point number two, having these weird ecosystem building activities is necessary. It's a necessary evil to create one or two programs that are true game changers, right? Because you're never going, like, it's a bit like seed investing, right? You need to invest in 100 for that one thing to kind of be the right model, right? And if you don't do those 100, you won't know the one. And so you need like one and two to work hand in hand. Now, take the Malaysian government, for example. Last year, they did one of the greatest, like, biggest moves in like the tech startup ecosystem in Southeast Asia, Penjana. So 600 million USD in matching grants for VCs that were willing to invest in Southeast Asian startups. Like, initially, they had a bit of a stricter requirement of how much that money could be deployed in Malaysia. They eventually relaxed that requirement, and today there's actually a lot. I mean, Carsome's big move to a $1.3 billion unicorn is primarily driven by a lot of these like recent investments and that push by the government in that later stage investing, right? So if I was to break it down, like, let's take Singapore, right? What Singapore did really well was they built these like two institutions, NUS, NTU, which generated a ton of engineering talent. It's modeled after the way, Stanford and Berkeley were built, like that California tech talent, right? And how Tel Aviv is three universities push out this incredible tech talent, IITs in India that push out this incredible tech talent. Singapore got that right. That's something that I think the Malaysian government needs to really work on. Like, how do you get the talent to improve in terms of its viability? Number two is like creating programs and systems that result in these one or two like amazing one-hit wonders, right? And they've not succeeded there. So, example, to Jangan's point just now, we have this crazy thing in the 90s called the multimedia super corridor. Disclaimer: I went to Multimedia University, which is one of those parts of that corridor. The idea was to create the Silicon Valley of Southeast Asia. What ended up happening is a lot of tech companies ended up having, because you had tax breaks if you set up your company there. So Hewlett Packard, Huawei, Dell end up setting these massive departments in Cyberjaya, and they ended up just staffing them with call center workers and doing customer service out of Malaysia. So they ended up being very low value jobs that didn't exactly result in that exponential change in Cyberjaya, which is the name of a town next to Putrajaya.
What is Cyberjaya for the?
So Cyberjaya is a town. Basically, it's a planned city. In the 90s, the Malaysian government went through a project to try and figure out how to replicate Silicon Valley. So they created a planned city called Cyberjaya. And Cyberjaya had a university, the one that I went to, which was like modeled after MIT and Stanford, it's like a tech university where people went to like learn the code and do creative stuff. And then there were a lot of other like functional like tax. So there was tax incentives for international tech companies to set up their bases there. What eventually ended up happening, the university worked out relatively well. Like it was well funded. They got a lot of like international lecturers. So in terms of quality of teaching and research, it was probably one of the best in Malaysia. But like the companies that ended up outsourcing their divisions here ended up sending call centers and low value jobs, right? So that kind of like tech talent transfer didn't exactly happen. Now contrast that to Singapore. Singapore did like a bunch of like different initiatives, and then I just point out one initiative that I'm in love with. It's called 100E, right? And so there's an institute called AI Singapore. And AI Singapore was like a bunch of government geeks who got together and they were like, how do we tap onto like the growth of AI and allow our government to ensure like the best outcomes for our people, right? 100E is a collaborative model where they're like, if you're a company that has an AI problem, we match you with AI researchers who can't find commercialization and problems to solve. So it's kind of like a matching organization with funding, with a layer of I think they provide somewhere between 200 and 250,000 Sing dollars of grants. They pair you up with all kinds of resources. So they're like, there's this dearth of research, commercial guys who can't find AI researchers. How about we solve that, right? And they've got at least 5 or 6 programs that are of this technical complexity that really, really cracks the problem. Sorry, chaps, I was cutting in and out there. I'm not sure if you got most of that. Hello.
But Andrew, did you finish, Andrew?
And are you done? If you're done, I have a few quick pointers here.
Yeah, I'm done. Sorry, that was a long rant. I was absorbing and then it flooded out.
Okay, so first, I pretty much deal with people in all the places, right? I mean, Southeast Asia, different countries, Middle East, China, to a certain extent, India, and recently a lot with Latin America. So, to be honest, I think Malaysia is the only country where people just have this obsession. I mean, not obsession, but people love to talk about government, talk about politics, joke about politics. I did have one instance where I was with a bunch of Malaysians and a bunch of Indonesians, and the Malaysians were complaining about, oh, our government is corrupt or whatever. And Indonesia, so what? I mean, our government has been corrupt, so what? I mean, let's just live on. So I do think Malaysians care about their country much more than any people from any other country. Your point about NTU and US building these institutions, I mean, I graduated from NTU on a scholarship, right? They offer to people from China, but at the same time, they had the scholarships for people from India. They had scholarships for people, I mean, from Vietnam. So all these things were consistent. I think at some point in time, I had a high school classmate who went to Heidelberg in Germany, and at some point in time, his professor, I think he was involved with sort of leading sort of biotech, whatever shit, and his professor was seriously considering an offer from Singapore because that's something that a publicly funded university in Europe couldn't match. So he eventually didn't go because of some other reasons, but it was just so attractive to him, and all these things were done in a consistent way over decades. I mean, it's not saying that, okay, I have a program for 4 years.
Yeah.
They in 30 years, I mean, the bureaucrat who was in charge of this program changed, and the new person has a different agenda. Then things, I mean, just think about Lazada, right? I mean, halfway you change CEOs and change CEO again, and of course, I mean, things are not consistent. So all these things were done in a consistent way, and over the years you see the benefits. I mean, initially, I mean, if you think all these grants, I mean, people have been complaining about grants, so you offer to people who don't deserve it, but who's there to judge? I mean, who deserves, who doesn't? And when they offered us scholarship to come to study in Singapore, and some of us asked, okay, what happens if people end up not staying in Singapore? And the government says that, I mean, we did the calculations, as long as a certain percentage of you guys stay in Singapore, then we were good enough. This investment is worth it.
Yeah.
Last point about, I mean, the thing about Malaysia, I don't know. I mean, I've been trying to do some benchmark between Southeast Asia and Latin America. I think Malaysia is in a way similar to Argentina, or in a way similar to Chile. So
I want to hear this.
similar to Argentina in the sense that, I mean, the first wave of internet entrepreneurs in Latin America came from Argentina. OX was co-founded by Argentinian.
Mercado Libre.
Libre is
Yeah,
from
True.
Argentina, etc. Chile is the country which the government probably works the hardest to attract people. Startup Chile. I mean, I have a bunch
No,
of friends who went there.
Startup Chile,
but
etc.
Chile developed, right? Much more than Malaysia.
I think Chile is like what?
They're closer to Singapore, I think.
I think they're closer to Malaysia.
Well, we visited, man. It feels much more developed than living in Malaysia, that's for sure.
Yeah, but if you think about from top tech talent point of view,
Okay,
and
yeah.
would they
I don't know if that's
Would they
true.
prefer to be in Santiago? Or would they prefer to be São Paulo or Miami
Okay.
or Bogota? I mean,
good
so
point, good point.
so it's,
I mean, if you like being close to Valparaiso and going to the beach and spending an hour to the mountains,
yeah, but that's that's not how you build a business. I mean, that's for lifestyle. I mean, lots of people went to stop Chile for lifestyle. I mean,
Yeah, Andrew's trying to retire.
have I been doing it wrong? Have it?
yeah. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, come on, guys. Like, I'm looking at Chile for completely different
yeah,
reasons.
exactly. So if you want to build a business, and I mean, if you think about that, Chile, what? 20 million people, 20 plus million people. Malaysia, 30 million.
Okay, I see your
Brazil,
point. I see your point.
212. Indonesia, 270. And also this is one thing I heard from a what do you call those kind of investors who invest in both public markets and crossover funds? Yeah. So from one guy from China, he has been exclusively investing in business outside China, and he was telling me that when you go to places like I mean big countries, when you go to Indonesia, when you go to Brazil, when you go to Lagos even, and even if the country is so fucked up, and you still feel that the people there give you a vibe they are in a big country, the level of confidence that they have is very different. I mean, you don't see that in relatively smaller countries, and that gives very big different dynamics, and that also, I mean, I think allows people to take risk in a different way.
Do you see that in Indonesia? It's a big country. Do you have that confidence? I don't think so, right? Or
I mean, if you put Indonesia and Malaysia together, I mean, Indonesia's definitely come across as, I mean, what they can execute is a different story, but they definitely come across as
I see what
more
you mean.
confident.
Yeah.
I think Indonesia is also having this new like resurgence of entrepreneurs that is creating a lot of trust and risk taking, right? Like I'm pulling from experience when I speak to people who are ex Lazada across the different markets.
Yeah.
The ex-Lazardians in Indonesia are all like, N-3 to CEO, but they're ready to quit and start a company because they've seen Bukalapak made it, they've seen GoTo make it. So like there's a lot more appetite, whereas like Malaysians, Thais still are looking for corporate jobs to jump into.
Can I simplify this to two things? So if you want to have a vibrant ecosystem, it comes down to the government's long-term ability to execute on long-term planning, and also either having ability to attract or grow the talent needed, right? So with that framework in mind, which country is poised to take advantage of this going forward in the Southeast Asia region?
Are we taking a vote?
Yeah,
Because again, I need to mention that as the sole Malaysian in this room and the one who's closest to a prison cell, I vote Malaysia.
I think Singapore, obviously, right, which they kind of proven already. But I think if you look,
absolutely.
The countries that I've lived and worked in, like Thailand and Vietnam, they have very well regarded local institutions. So they do have this kind of ability to grow talent. And I guess if the government opened up policies to attract further foreign talent, that works out. But in terms of central planning, probably, or ability to execute on long-term planning, Vietnam, hopefully, I think locals might disagree because they're quite, I don't know, sometimes they're a bit negative on the government ability to do stuff. But from what I see as an outsider, they have that ability, I think.
But locals disagree. It's the same way as the Shopee employees in 2017 saying that the company has so many problems, not going to work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, one of my bets is definitely Vietnam for both checkboxes. At least local talent, the institutions where I would hire from in Thailand definitely have universities for that too. So Malaysia, I don't feel like there's this kind of Harvard in Malaysia. I don't know. That's just my take.
Well, I think the point that I think it's a very fair point. Like this point about like the stability of the country in terms of political landscape and long-term planning. And so I think the interesting analogy or the interesting line that we can draw between, say, Vietnam, Singapore, and the PRC is they're all single-party systems, right? We don't have actual transitions or changes to government like you would have in, say, Malaysia or Thailand or the Philippines. So that actually is helpful in their ability to sort of like at least do the planning part. Execution, of course, is always a different question, but at least they have the infrastructure to be able to do that kind of planning.
Yep.
I would say, I mean, I agree with you, Singapore, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And I always have this belief that Malaysia is a very good testing ground for the region.
I agree. agree.
And yeah. I mean, it has the cost structure and also solve the problems of emerging markets, but it also has the maturity and international access.
I mean, we're all based here too, so
Yeah.
it says something, right? It says something.
I'm not, but yeah. Yeah.
Well,
but
Singapore trapped you. It could have been. It could. Malaysia could get you in the future. I mean, who knows?
Isn't your wife Malaysian? So technically, Malaysia's already got
but-
you.
Yeah, but she's here. She's in Singapore as well. So anyway,
It's a Trojan horse, bro.
so one thing.
We sent her. Trojan horse. You know the story of the Trojan horse?
Yes. I also know the story of Helen. But anyway, so
Yes, correct. Your wife's basically Helen of Troy.
That's not a very nice thing to say, actually.
Yeah, that's actually not a nice thing.
Why? What? Maybe I missed the rest of it. Did we watch the same movie?
Okay, sorry, John.
Movie?
Okay.
No,
Not to take from John's point. Helen of Troy was a bit of a harlot. She left her husband to shack up with some other dude, i.e. Paris, and that's how the whole Trojan War started.
Fair point.
yes.
It's not.
I take that back, Jagan.
Yeah, it's not a very nice thing to say.
I was literally talking about the concept of a Trojan horse without considering the cheating aspect of it.
Fine. Back to the point. I think the point about talent. Every single person I know who's not from Malaysia, who has lived in Malaysia, love the country, love the
That's
people,
true, actually.
they love the ability to go around. I mean, they love the lifestyle,
That's a very good point.
and they love the work ethics of most of the people in Kuala Lumpur, at least. But many of them still choose to live in Singapore because it just offers them better access to everything else. So that's something that Malaysia probably needs to think about. I to date I still don't understand the argument why they scrapped the high-speed railway, and because some people are arguing that that's going to cause a brain drain, but I think this other way around. I mean, it allows people to live in Kuala Lumpur while still have access to all these resources in Singapore. But of course, I mean, that goes into deep waters, which
Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't know if we want to get into that.
It also
There's
goes
probably
into
some-
it. Yeah, no, look, I think that's more like who benefits and who should pay for it.
Correct.
It's a
Yeah,
deeper,
it's incentives.
more
Yeah,
technical
correct.
question, right? Yeah.
We won't name names.
Yeah. No. Malaysia's great, everyone. Vote Malaysia.
Yeah, I think this was a good place to probably end, guys. Unless you have any final comments.
No, I think we're good.
All right, guys.
Love you guys.
Alright.
Yes.
Love
Love
you.
Alright, guys.
Love you too, Jangan.
All right.
See you.
I'll see you guys soon.
Bye bye.
Love you, boy. Ciao. Cheers, guys.
Yeah.
Ciao.